Let's talk about if it's ever okay to trespass on somebody's land or under what situations or conditions you might allow a trespasser on your own land. So I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. And one of the things that I do is starting to move towards being a nomadic caretaker of hunting land and farmland in my region. So this means I would go out and stay on a piece of property. I might be putting up signage and doing perimeter checks. I might be taking care of wildlife areas or working on trail management, or I might be sitting animals. So if farmers on vacation, I might be sitting their animals. And this is a thing I'm doing using the skills of my permaculture design certification and the Master Naturalist program. I'm also in many cases filming on location at their property. So maybe they've invited me to as a consultant, and then we're talking about a piece of land, and then I might film something. But essentially these are private property. And then there are situations where they've had problems with trespassers on that private property. I've written about that in the newsletter a couple times, is that uh, you are putting all this time and effort into your land. You're creating roads and building trails, and then some jackass comes along and is riding their ATV around. Now, again, I've done some videos about folks, riding ATVs around on land that I'm managing, and they shouldn't be on that land, and they're not authorized to be on that land. And I sound like a pompous ass because I'm saying nobody can have any fun. I'm being I guess a kin would it be, but legitimately talking to the sheriff's department and talking with my insurance company or in the other insurance laws, rules, and regulations for the state of Virginia. If you cross a property line, you are criminally trespassing, especially if it's agricultural land. However, there are times I have been across the property line, and there are times the property line is not where it's supposed to be. And so you could be looking at the GIS, maybe you're on OnX Hunt. And by the way, there'll be links in the descriptions to some resource pages because I do use a number of tools like OnX Hunt and uh, Garmin GPSs, things like that. There are times where the lines at your county GIS don't match the lines on the original plat for the property. So you have a legal boundary for the property. You have a practical boundary for the property, which could be fence lines, which could be roads, and then you have the actual property lines that are in the GIS. Ideally, all these boundaries would work together. But for example, you could have a piece of property that has a road inside the property line shared by multiple neighbors. And so is it trespassing if they have a guest come to their property who crosses that road? Well, not necessarily, because that road is a right of way granted through easement to the property that's, let's say, behind you. And now that road becomes an access point. Could you ever trespass your neighbor for using the road? Not necessarily. Could you ever trespass somebody who uses the road who is not visiting your neighbor and has not been otherwise permitted to go back and visit your neighbor? Well, yes, you can. And so that is a boundary of convenience because the road may designate land on either side that is ownership. It has different ownership, but the road itself is not perfectly aligned in the middle of the property line. So on one property I manage, there's a road that crosses a leg of the property I manage, and then it runs along another property that I don't own, I don't manage, and then connects back to the land that I manage. Now, is this road permissible for me to transit between two pieces of property in which I have the rights to access? Well, not necessarily. It just depends. But in this case, we ended up surveying, and there's a 250-foot difference between the GIS property line and the actual legal permitted property line. And this road actually is right inside the legally permitted, the plat related property line. And then there was actually an overgrown, another road off this way, which is the owner of that property. So they are permitted by easement to cross the property I manage, but I'm permitted to continue on the road on the side that is inside the property boundaries that are now clearly marked. I know, folks, this can be very confusing, and this is why it really matters how you interact with people. So I have a little hypey on the video, and I am carrying a firearm when I'm out on the property. It could have a shotgun, could have a pistol, but you're not going to engage someone who you find out is across the property line. And then even if you're not hunting your own property, you still, during hunting season, we'll dress accordingly because somebody could wander off. Now, we have to assume the best of intentions for people, but there are cases, for example, somebody leaves a state property and they cross onto private property and they think they're still on state property. So state property allows to have certain rights. Federal land and state land allows certain rights to hunt, to transit, to move across the land. BLM land is very often this kind of issue. But the underlying factor is once they cross private land, there are new rules and regulations, and it is the responsibility of the person transmitting across land or moving across land or en route across land to know where they're located. So let's talk about some of those cases where I have trespassed on other people's property, but the owner of that property would not have a concern or be bothered by it. And the very first case is when I have previous permission from the owner. So technically, if I cross my property line or a property that I'm on and have the rights to be on onto private land, even if I've had verbal permission in the past, and this maybe is months later, I cannot go onto that land and do certain things. So let's leave it at that. So I can leave the private property onto someone else's property along the property line or a fence boundary, because there is a right of way on either side of that, with previous acknowledgement, but I couldn't hunt. I couldn't go near their buildings or near areas that are away from the property line, the interior of the property. I could cross someone's property at the fence line. And by the way, this is not legal advice. This is just an example of where it may be permissible. So if you see somebody walking down your fence line and they're crossing your property to another location, taking a shortcut across your land, you may not want to shoot them the first time you see it. Now you can have a talk with them and you can trespass them from the property. You can say, hey, look, we've got bulls out here. We've got livestock out here. I don't want anybody crossing the fence line, because a fence is a positive barrier. Okay, and I'm going to cover a bunch of terminology here. We can talk in detail when we do a workshop. But if someone's crossed that fence line and they're now on your property and they're at the fence line moving from one location to another, it's always best to give them the benefit of the doubt. Ask them first to identify themselves, to provide an address of where they've come from and some kind of phone number. You say, hey, if you don't mind, I'm going to snap a quick picture. Nobody should be offended by that. In fact, that's what I expect. Now, if it turns out it's the kid of somebody you've given previous permission to cross the property, such as a neighbor who's going to cross the property to another piece of land that they have, you haven't got everything all worked up. Second, it's very important to know that it could be a state or local official who within the right-of-way on that land, or it could be somebody from a utility company within the right-of-way on that land, could move from one location to another at the perimeter of your property, not the interior of your properties. If you see somebody wandering around your shed or your barn or something like that, you're still going to ask them who they are. You're going to get a picture, and then you're going to trespass them, which tells them to leave the property immediately. Doesn't matter who they are. They can be a state official. They can be a law enforcement. They can be all kinds of different people. But you can tell them to leave the land, especially if they're in the interior of the property. But from a practical purpose, if somebody's walking your fence line and maybe they got lost, maybe they're moving from one side of the property to the other, you want to find out who they are. You want to get a picture. You want to get some details. And then if they ever do it again, you have evidence to support a claim against them for trespassing. Now, what about in the state of Virginia if you need to retrieve an animal? So let's say you're hunting. You've shot a deer on your property, and that's one thing that a lot of folks that we work with are interested in doing. They're improving the natural habitat in order to improve deer count, quail, turkey, whatever they're interested in hunting. But let's say somebody legitimately during season on another piece of property hits a deer, shoots the deer, and now the deer has moved onto your property. Because see, wild animals can move on your property anytime they feel like it. And in fact, you cannot obstruct wildlife from migrating and moving across your property. There are actually federal laws against that. But let's say it's a neighbor or somebody who's hunting on neighboring land, and they're going to retrieve a wounded animal from your property. In most states, that's legal. It's still trespassing. And if they keep doing it, you might want to look into that because they could be standing on the other property and shooting stuff on your land. But ultimately, how do we handle that? Well, first off, we find out who they are. What is their intention? Now, remember, they're going to have a firearm with them. And so we want to be nice and polite. Hey, how's it going? It's hunting season. Everything okay? Okay. Well, you may not be aware, but you're on private property. What's going on? Oh, well, you're retrieving an animal. You can either come with them. Now, my local sheriff said, snap the picture. Say, hey, if you don't mind, I'd like to get a picture. And, here's my number. You can give them your contact information in case they want to come on the property, because they really should call you first, and there should be signage out there. But ultimately, they can retrieve that animal. No problem. Now, if you have livestock that has left your land, guess what? State of Virginia, you need to retrieve that animal. And so you can enter someone else's property without permission, without forenotice, to retrieve that animal. Best practice is to call your neighbor, to know who your neighbors are, and call them and say, hey, I just lost a couple goats and I see them out on your property heading towards your rose garden. So do you mind if I pick those up? In most cases, the neighbor's going to say no problem. Now, it is the responsibility of the agricultural landowner to have proper fencing so that their animals stay within the property in the majority of states. Again, this is not legal advice. This is just building awareness, because I've heard a lot of things. Folks are saying to me, oh, just don't be a jerk. And why are you stopping people from having fun? Or why are you going to send someone to jail for being on your property? Well, again, because there's laws, rules, and regulations that we need to follow in order to preserve private property rights. So if you're investing time, effort, and resources into growing out food for your family or your community, you're spending time, money, and resources to raise livestock in a healthy way, then you need to make sure that your property is secured. If you have a neighbor that doesn't secure their property, that's not necessarily your problem, but if the problem starts coming to your land. And then, of course, you may not be aware, and it's heavily underreported, there are a lot of agricultural thefts that happen where people steal equipment, livestock, tools, and such from properties. So again, I could go into a lot more detail about appropriate times to trespass. Understand that it might be appropriate for you to trespass, but the other person can still be upset, and they most likely will criminally trespass you. So if you've been asked, if they say, I'm trespassing you from this property, do not return to this property and immediately leave this property by that gate there, and you don't do that, then you have violated a law in most states, and they have every right to call the sheriff's department on you. Now, when I've talked to the sheriff's department about this, they've let me know that there have been cases where crackheads are out on properties with firearms. So somebody's going out on a property to plink and target shoot, and they've been smoking some weed and taking some crack or whatever the hell they've done, or they've got a meth factory out on your piece of property, some of the larger pieces of properties. One of the things that I'll do is do a patrol and see if there has been any changes in the environment, if there's a patch of trees that are cut down that we didn't know about. If there's been buildings, shanty sheds, tents, or whatever, we have to know about those things. But it's not commonly in the news, but these homeless camps aren't just out in cities. Sometimes on rural land, you'll find somebody who's set up land. Now, I would like to do this on a workshop and actually bring in a lawyer and talk about these details, because these are very important. If someone is on your land and they get hurt, they have every right, but it's debatable, but they can sue you. So maybe they don't have a right to sue you because they've criminally trespassed, but they sue you anyway. You still have the headache and the frustration of being sued. If you are putting thousands of dollars, like some of my clients are putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into land and acquiring land and getting roads on that land and getting fences on that land and putting livestock on that land and raising habitat on that land so that there are stronger, healthier bucks, and so that the fish in their pond is stocked, and then some idiots coming across the fence and fishing it, well, you have every right to be upset. But there are cases where you can't prevent that. And so we're looking at property rights, we're looking at land use and management, and then we're also looking at, do you have signage, barriers, and all that. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. In the comments below, please ask your land management questions that are related to the security and safety of your property. Okay, ask those in the comments below. So ask about signage, ask about how to handle trespassers. I hope I've given you a good kit here to get started. This does mean you need to carry your camera or a smartphone or some kind of device to take photographic evidence. The photographic evidence is very important. We can talk about that later. And then if you are carrying a firearm, to make sure that you are able to use it appropriately, because there is a high probability these days that you're going to run into somebody on your property who doesn't believe they're doing anything wrong and is armed. So a hunter who's followed game on your property and they've yelled at you and said, I'm on state land. I ain't on your land. I can do whatever the hell I want. That's dangerous. That has happened. I've heard stories about that. And then also the fact that you run into somebody who's armed, could be running from the police. They could be camping out there. They could have when I was a kid, I went out on this piece of property that is one of our neighbors. I knew the neighbors. I had every right to be back there. And I come across a little old logging road that has, for about 600 feet, marijuana plants. And it was basically a grow operation that the neighbors were Amish. They didn't know it was going on back there. And it was right up on the property line. So legitimately, you can walk the property line of somebody's property. If you're moving between two properties that you own that are also bordering that. And you can also walk the property line of most fence lines because they're clear. But ultimately, you can't set up a grow operation. Not supposed to be doing that. So again, what are the situations you've heard about? Put those in the comments below. What are the questions you have? And what I'll do is I'll let you know about a workshop, and we'll get online. We'll get a lawyer. We'll get some people with experience. Work with a lot of forestry folks. There's rules about forestry. And then you'll be more informed as a property owner, but also have better experiences in the outdoors. Because I have had neighbors come up to me and say, look, I've been hunting that land for 30 years. Do you mind if I go back there? And here's what I said. I said, there's a couple rules. My insurance company says we're going to have livestock back there, so this is what I'm expecting. And it basically came down to a handshake, and I of course document the written permission, and basically I have a very small group of people who during hunting season can hunt that land because I'd like to learn how to hunt it. And so I end up going out with them. I'll learn from them. Gentleman that's been hunting that land for 30 years. He's going to have some things that I don't know, and I'll certainly learn from him. And ultimately, we'll have some useful value there. So again, I don't really care if you think I'm a jerk, because I will send somebody to jail over trespassing on a piece of property I'm managing. But again, questions below. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. Visit us at www.prosperityhomestead.org. And if you have a question that you don't want to put in the comments below, that's okay. Visit the website at www.prosperityhomestead.org. Go to the contact page and we can do a discovery call. I'd love to hear about your success stories. I love to hear about your property projects. And small farms are going to make a massive difference. Small farms to you, your homestead is going to make a massive difference to your lifestyle. Your hunting property managed the right way is going to be amazing memories for a lifetime. And then even land that you're developing with other people are going to serve that community. Let's make sure that happens with the minimal amount of frustrations. Again, I'm Justin Hitt from Prosperity Homestead, and I'll see you in the next podcast.